All right, kia ora everyone. Good evening. Welcome along to the third in our series, and thank you very much for everyone's come back. It's great to have you back on a Wednesday afternoon, so thank you very much. As I said before, and as I'll always say, without our support of Jeb, we wouldn't be able to run this series and how important it is. So what I'd like to do is just run a little promo to sort of kick things off, and then I'd like to ask Arama from Jeb to talk a little bit. Then I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker after that. So I'll just run this for us. So again, without our kind support of Jeb, we wouldn't be able to run this series, and I just can't express how grateful we are to. So Aaron, would you like to come and say a few words on behalf of the company? It'd be great to have that.
Awesome, thank you, Lee. Cheers. Thank you all. And a big thanks to yourself and to the University of Auckland. You put on some absolutely amazing topics week after week, and today is no exception to that one as well. So I'm not going to take too long. We have an amazing kind of topic up, one that is relevant to everybody in the industry and moving forward, and just happy to be part of it from our side of things. So thank you all very much for taking the time to come through tonight as well. Cheers.
Right, while lovely Val solves the problems, as usual, and while she's here, I'd like to thank Val and Nikki up there to help run the whole system for me. It was absolutely fantastic. Seriously, it's an absolute pleasure. I actually asked Dr. Natalie Allen to come along and talk to us tonight, and she's talking about housing in New Zealand, housing in Aotearoa as a vision to solve the housing crisis. And I think, just as you said, Arama, it's the incredible pressing challenges that are facing us all about social housing, affordable housing, the whole issue about housing, and the idea of community creation that comes with this. Natalie has a distinguished career, and I have to say, from a personal point of view, she was one of my own students, and it's great to see one of my PhD students with Errol doing such successfully well in her own career, developing her own company, pushing along the debate, and really, really exercising all the things that she got from us, and of course a graduate of the school. So, I mean, there's just so many things you've done, Natalie. I'm just so proud of everything you've done as an individual. So I'll pass it over to her because I'll stop there because, again, I'm just so proud of what she's done and all the things she's done with us. So without further ado, Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lee. Marvellous. Gosh, it was circa 2 decades ago that I sat in these very seats in this lecture theatre and vowed to be relentlessly optimistic about housing systems change in New Zealand. So it's always great to pop back for a visit, and thank you to everyone who came out tonight. So that I know who we've got in the room, can I just see a show of hands who we've got from an architecture background and a planning background, kind of urban design, miscellaneous? Love that. I'd also put my hand up, given I now run an urban strategy firm, because when I graduated all the jobs seemed a bit dull, so the urban advisory felt like a more fun option. And how many students have we got in the room? Okay, awesome. I don't know whether to just like keep going.
Sorry, we're very nearly there with you.
That's all right. Well, I will say, I hope tonight is, is particularly fun for everyone. I really mean it when I say relentlessly optimistic, but that's not to say that I don't know how grim it is out there when it comes to housing. And I think the key thing is that we've got to be solution focused. And by that, I also mean the nuts and bolts of those solutions. Oh, fantastic, we're in business. And just so there were lots of hands of architects in the room, and there are lots of diagrams, but also stats in this presentation. But just for you, I've thrown in a whole lot of images so that I can keep you with me on the journey. So if you're waning, hopefully very soon there'll be some beautiful pictures for you. So what's the goal? Look, there's so many different professional lenses I could use to frame housing, but ultimately I think for us all there's this real element of it being personal. So for me, when I think about the goal, I think of my two girls, Phoebe, who's just started school, and my joyful, sass-filled Aubrey, who's 16 months. And what I want for their future is that there are secure, genuinely affordable homes, that free up household budgets for all kinds of exciting things in terms of education, upskilling, and entrepreneurship. I want there to be mixed tenure, multi-generational neighbourhoods so that we have care built into our whole system. I want there to be kind of housing amenity ecosystems so that we can live close to all the things we need to make our daily lives convenient. And I don't think any of those things need to be a luxury. I think we need to build them into our system. So that's kind of my goal. As we go through the presentation, I want you to percolate on your goal. And that's kind of how I'm going to end things today. But what is the current state? First of all, I want to talk for a quick second about why housing matters. Whether you see it as a pathway to personal wealth creation, whether you see it as part of a productivity equation for the nation, or whether you see it as a housing right, the data actually tells us that all those perspectives can be true because housing is the foundation of a thriving society, no matter how you cut it. So in terms of speaking to how interconnected housing is with everything, I like to think, for example, in education terms, the more schools you've attended, the less likely you are to pass NCEA. So the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study directly links that if you've moved more than 3 times, your rates start dropping pretty quickly. If you think about that for a minute, and then you think of the fact that the Treasury has identified that New Zealand has one of the highest rates in the OECD of residential mobility among families of school-aged children. So we move a lot. And that's partly because we have quite short rental tenures and we don't stay in places for long, and sometimes it's really hard to stay renting somewhere and you have to move to a different school zone. So housing is the foundation of so many things. If I think about it in health terms, and we think about it in terms of economics, we get 4 times the benefit from every dollar we spend when we make houses warmer and drier. I actually saw a really great study by the global economic firm NERA, who looked at the value to London of reducing house prices. And they calculated that if you could reduce prices by 1% across the city, over a decade, you'd save approximately 16.8 billion New Zealand dollars. So I would love to do a similar calculation for Auckland, because this kind of gets to the crux, I think, of why housing matters so much and how interconnected it is. So there's so many different stats out there that could frame what the current state of housing is. You could say that we've got 19,000 plus applicants on the social housing register. You could look at how the number of unsheltered people, homeless people in Auckland nearly doubled between, late 2024 and mid-2025, based on data from community outreach providers. You could look at the kind of economic analysis that estimated that long-term national housing shortfall was over 80,000 homes. We can also think about it in terms of people. So, nearly 3 out of 10 homeowners spend more than 30% of their income on housing. 4.5, we could round it up to 5. Renters spend over 30% of their income. It's worse if you're Māori or Pacifica. And then 2 out of 10 children are in households that spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Why does that matter? Because the definition of housing stress globally is that spending more than 30% of your income on housing means that you are not able to spend money on other critical things in life. This kind of originated in the US out of HUD, but it's been adopted around the world. It's used in New Zealand by Stats NZ in their official household economic survey. It's used by the Ministry of Social Development, MSD, when they're looking at doing their calculations and eligibility for financial support. It's used by academics as well. So what does this mean in terms of people? Because at the end of the day, that's what it always comes back to. So I'm going to just introduce a couple of personas that are going to stay with us throughout the presentation. So we've got a professional couple, we've got a registered nurse and a senior grad architect, estimating their salaries, looking at what their living costs would be, and what their additional living expenses would be. They end up with a disposable income, which means that in 5 to 6 years, they could probably afford one of these houses at the top, which you kind of go, okay, there's a little bit of affordability built in there, completely wiped out if they want to have children or if house prices increase. So I think sometimes when we talk about affordability, we talk about it right now, but we forget about the long-term shifts and we forget about how people's life stages change and their housing requirements are actually really dynamic. Then we've got a single income family. So we've got a family of 4, mechanic, one full-time parent, living at home with 2 kids. So their combined household income is obviously a bit lower, but they've got higher housing costs because they need more space. They've got higher living costs. They have a very small annual disposable income. And so it would take them, assuming they don't want to do anything fun, 26 years to be able to afford one of the houses at the top. Assuming, again, that, house prices and incomes stay relatively similar. But if we look at history, that's not the case. We'll come back to them a lot. And this is actually persona 3 because I cut one out because I was worried about time. We've got, young professional in Wellington. Fantastic. She's living in a flat share at the moment but has dreams of returning to her whenua in Otaki. So, at the moment, it would take her about 12 years to be able to buy a studio apartment in Wellington. Much longer than that if she wants to return home because the average house price in Otaki is 720 odd grand right now, which if you think about regional New Zealand is kind of wild. So we have all these people who are just average everyday New Zealanders, and we can start to see why. There's ways to frame it where you can say that affordability is still kind of there, but there's also a whole lot of really compelling reasons why we need to acknowledge that affordability has drastically slipped away. I did want to include a few stats about the Bank of Mum and Dad because I feel like it does get covered quite a lot, and it is a real thing. If you are the child of a homeowner who can, extract the equity from their home, you're likely to have 39% more housing wealth by the time you turn 30 than if you're a child of renters. It's a pretty stark stat. And also, if you're a child of a homeowner, you're 78% more likely to own a home. So there's a whole lot of intergenerational inequality that we've built into the housing system that we've chosen for ourselves. And I think we need to reflect on that, and that needs to be a big part of the narrative going forward. So what are the strands that I'm going to try and weave together tonight? First of all, the kind of foundations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing system, what it is, how do we unpack it, how does it relate to the housing market. Then I'm going to do a little bit of, critical analysis or share a few things about the myths and realities of the system. Then I'm going to talk about the strategic outcome, the good, exciting stuff about what can we do about all of this. And I'm going to share a little bit about what I think needs to be in a New Zealand housing strategy. So let's start with the housing system. What is it? It's the entire network of all the drivers, policies, programs, providers that influence housing. It's different from the housing market. The housing market is just a component of it. The housing market being, the buying, selling and renting of private property, and everybody that's involved in doing that. And I think sometimes in the narrative in New Zealand we talk a lot about the housing market and maybe not enough about the housing system. Because the housing system is about how everybody has the opportunity to have a secure tenure. Whereas in many times, the speculation that's involved in the housing market, it's not a bad thing, it's great, it serves a lot of people, but it's only one component of the overall system. I like to think of it as alchemy, and this is why I think it's really important that designers get involved in the conversation. Because in order to unpack the housing market and rethink about creative solutions, it's so helpful to have a design brain. And I think it's really important to, again, think about all the different players that are part of it, but then also think about all the different forces that are in play. Whether it's, technical innovation, all the political cycles that are happening, global capital flows, infrastructure capacity and funding. You've got to follow the money in this game. Including all the policy cycles. There's obviously the environmental resilience piece, which is going to be huge going forward in New Zealand, and it's going to impact our housing system so much. And also all the players in terms of the role of insurance, etc. There's also this global supply chain resilience. It's really expensive to build in New Zealand for many reasons. It all kind of comes into play in the housing market. Then, of course, we've got all the demographic shifts in that we're an ageing population, we're having kids later, all that kind of stuff. So at the moment, I truly think we've got a system built for its primary market, and it's great that it serves those people. And it's not to say that anything about serving those people is a negative. The issue is that it doesn't serve everybody, but everybody needs somewhere to live. So at the moment in New Zealand, we've got about 63% homeowners, 36% renters. But if you look at what kind of product or what houses we're building, 95% of them are actually targeted at homeowners and 5% are targeted at rental product. So if you think about it in terms of a continuum, which often gets raised, we're putting a lot of effort into serving a pretty small portion of the continuum and not much effort in serving a big, huge chunk of it. And so when I like to think about the housing system and what we need to do, I like to kind of unpack the housing continuum a little bit. So let's talk about it. At the moment in New Zealand, we've got market ownership, market rental, and some public rental in terms of kāinga ora and chip provided homes, kind of baked into our business as usual way of doing things. We're starting to get some more options coming online, because of all the affordability challenges. It's fantastic to see some shared equity schemes like what they're doing out in Tamaki. It's great to see, the likes of Simplicity charging ahead with build to rent. It's fantastic to see some papa kāinga coming online, which are, a phenomenal way of being able to live and particularly facilitate a return to the whenua for many. There's also some fantastic co-housing projects out there, and it's great that these options are coming online, but we've still got a few gaps. So here's a whole lot more that, around the world have been tried and tested, and yes, we totally need to come up with the New Zealand Inc. version of all these things. It's not about, copying necessarily, but I think it is about being inspired, particularly by, all the legal frameworks, all the design opportunity that's inherent in a lot of these different models. I'd love to talk about all of them in great detail, but we don't have time. But my team has been doing research into all these different models, particularly, the barriers and opportunities in terms of implementing them in New Zealand. And so if anyone is super passionate about it, please come and chat to me afterwards, because, I'm always keen to go into more detail. But for now, I think what's important is that we can just say we don't yet have the diversity of options that we potentially could have that would start to serve different parts of the continuum. Here's the moment for all you designers to just take a deep breath. And the great thing about these assisted options is that they often look glorious. So these are all projects that I've had the joy of getting to visit on various study tours that we've done, because my business partner Greer and I really like to invest in going and seeing and meeting all the people that have been there and delivered all these different models, and talking to them about what it was like to deliver, what were the nuts and bolts, but also what's it like to live in all these spaces. So definitely check them out. There is so much innovation around the world in terms of housing that we definitely don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I think it's just a case of looking at, what we want it to look like in New Zealand. I think cooperatives are particularly compelling for many life stages. It's basically, you might invest in the business that owns the building, and you have shares either to occupy your space, or it might be that if you've got some spare capital floating around, you might invest in a cooperative that's specifically set up to house students, to house refugees. There were some phenomenal examples in Zurich and Vienna to also support, victims of domestic violence, all kinds of things. But basically, the way that they're set up means that over time, rents actually decrease. They're also, fantastic places to be. And I think, the design goes hand in hand with the legal structure, the planning structure. So, globally, there are different places that have different combinations and options making up their housing market. I showed the sort of 60-40% split we've got in New Zealand. In Zurich, 9% owner-occupied, 71% private rental, 20% are these kind of largely cooperatives with a little bit of social. United States, a bit more like us. Vienna, pretty balanced and even. So in many ways, if we think about changing the housing system, we also influence the market, but in all these instances, the market is still there, and for the people whom the market serves, the market continues. But for the people whom the market, as we've set it up, don't serve, they have options. So going back to, our friends that we met earlier, these are all the kinds of options that could suit our young couple, so that if they did decide to have a family, rather than not being able to afford anywhere, they'd have a whole lot of options open up to them, and they could, move around the continuum from maybe an assisted ownership model to a market ownership model over time. And what I think this shows is that you can play in the market, but sometimes you need a little bit of help at particular life stages in order to get there. Because for many, the barrier to entry is pretty high, and the only place we've got for people to go is public housing at the moment. And that's why these assisted options are really powerful. So our family of four, heaps of options, but because of their incomes, will probably be sitting in that assisted place for a really long time before they could contemplate a market option. Our single woman could have heaps of options if there was an entry level where she could get in an assisted. Because of her career trajectory, she'd probably be able to, play in the market as she progressed in life. And that's what I think we really want. It's that diversity of options and that mobility for people around the system. And it really comes from introducing these new types of tenures to the system. So a few myths and realities. I really like this quote, and we were thinking in the office, we'd worked with a whole lot of councils in particular around the country who are really asking us, how can we change the dial? Like, what do our housing strategies need to be? And at the end of the day, no matter what advice we could give with international examples, everyone wanted local data, and that local data was kind of missing. And so when we thought, how do we start to better support this wider cohort of New Zealanders to have housing mobility along the continuum and introduce this reality of more diverse housing options for people, the one answer we came to is actually, first of all, we need more data. That's why we created the New Zealand Housing Survey, so that we could essentially get that data. Our end game is actually kind of an interactive housing insights tool, working with some of our tech partners. It'll have interactive maps and dashboards and all kinds of cool stuff. But for now, it's really about getting all that information from people about all the trade-off hierarchies of how they make housing decisions and what's important to them. So this kind of started back in 2020. When we started, developing all the questions. We worked on a number of test cases where we did projects with a local council in Kapiti with 2 different iwi groups, Ngāti Toa and Ngāhapo o Taki of Ngāti Raukawa. And then we also did a regional test in Dargaville and used the data in a private plan change process. So each time we tested out how we could do the survey with people, how they responded, but also how we could use that data to kind of influence, planning processes or other ways to actually unlock money to help these different groups do something for housing. Then we kind of got into, all the scripting. We got an awesome Callaghan grant, which enabled us to have a student come and work on how to automate a lot of the analysis for us. We did a whole bunch of industry reviews about how the data could be used. We did some academic peer reviews. We did a whole bunch of user testing, which was hilarious, particularly because my parents, who are 80 and 85, were part of the bunch. And then we launched. We got our first 2,500 responses that we decided was like our final test for how everything was working. And we're about to release our first report, but more than that, we're about to go into a whole year next year of nationwide comms to promote the survey, to try and get the data so that we can really answer all these questions. So definitely we don't have quite the distribution across all the demographic factors that we would like to have. And, for example, we have slightly lower percentage of Māori and Pacific currently doing the survey. And we think that the way to address that is to do partnerships, particularly, with iwi and different community organisations, where they will do the survey among whānau and we will give them the data so that they can use it for all kinds of different purposes. And this whole idea of reciprocity that we're building into things, we hope will mean that we get really big numbers of people doing the survey, but also a really good distribution of people doing the survey. So that's kind of a little bit about the goal. But for now, what are we hearing, even right off the bat? So I like to think of it in terms of, myth busting sometimes. So whichever mild luxury you want to insert, whether it's avocado toast or Netflix, any headline that you've seen, the reality that we've got so far is that 60% of respondents reported at least one financial strain that prevented them from doing something important. That could be going to the doctor, it could be heating or cooling their home efficiently, It could be being able to see family as much as they wanted to. And then 30% of respondents reported 3 financial strains or more. So again, it kind of comes down to, yes, sometimes the statistic might make it look like those people are okay, but it excludes all those really important life choices that actually make life enjoyable, in terms of those, human connections that you're able to have. But also some things are really fundamental when it comes to, trading off healthcare. What really startled me is that one of the most prevalent strains that people commented on was that they were skipping meals because housing was so expensive. And so I think that unless we have that data, there's so much missing from the story, because we really don't have a record of all these sacrifices that people are making to stay in, the housing market within the housing system. This one we hear all the time. We just need more houses, more supply. And I always add, in the right places, the right tenures and the right types of houses so that people can thrive. Because yes, we totally do need more houses, no doubt about it. We haven't built enough. But I really think that that argument alone doesn't give us the full picture. And so, when we think about the choices people make and their trade-off hierarchies, we had 26% who rated amenities and proximity to services. People love living close to supermarkets, cafes, all the places that they need to access. That really impacts people's choices for where they live. So even though, yes, we need more houses, if we build them in all the wrong places, it's still not going to solve the problem. Or if we build a whole lot of 3-bedroom houses that we don't need, it's also not going to solve the problem. And I think sometimes a lot of our demand calculations in New Zealand are based on existing data, and that's kind of problematic when you're trying to change what's available. So at the moment, nearly 80% of our stock is still 3-bedroom standalone homes. Yes, we're building lots more, medium density, but we don't have that variety yet. However, when we calculate demand, we look at what people are currently choosing. It's a little bit like if you went to the supermarket and you really wanted to buy a pear, but you got there and all they had were apples. And you were like, well, I wanted a pear, but I guess I can have an apple. You picked an apple. That's the day they were doing research and they were like, everybody chose apples, no need to buy pears in. It's kind of what we've got in this self-fulfilling prophecy of saying, well, people are choosing the stock that we've got, so we don't need to diversify. It's like, but people might choose really different things if they were able to. Which kind of takes us into the next headline I love, which is that everyone wants standalone homes. But when we asked people, so far what we've been hearing is that 2/3 of people would actually, who are under 35, would consider living in low-rise apartments, and nearly half would consider a high-rise apartment. And this was kind of across the board in different centres. We also gave explanations, short ones that were easy to read, of all kinds of different types of housing models. And we asked people if they thought any of those would suit them in their life. And 59% were like, yeah, co-housing sounds like a good idea. 34% were like, rent to buy, sounds handy. Same with cooperatives and community land trusts, pretty much all close. And this idea of shared equity as well. And I think these are the numbers when people can just see a simple explanation but maybe don't understand kind of the profound impact that some of these different housing models could have on their ability to live and have more of a disposable income to do a whole lot more stuff, and participate in our economy in whole lots of different ways. So I think this is, a real interesting myth that we can start to bust, and I'm super excited about having more data in this space. Again, definitely keep in touch if you want more data. We will be doing releases, but I just wanted to kind of give you a taste for now, because I think it's really important to kind of think of all these stories that we hear all the time in the media and all the headlines, and really think about unpacking what they mean and whether or not we actually think that that's true when we think of our friends and our colleagues and those around us in our community. I think as we get more data and we kind of build the platform, I hope it means we're able to really bust a few of the prevailing myths that, float around about housing, because I think that that's what will enable us to shift towards, being creative and solving the real problems that we've built into our housing system. So a housing strategy for New Zealand. Lots of people have said it's a great idea. We've tried to do it before. This is like a real document. I haven't made this with AI. However, AI had some great ideas about what was needed. And I think the thing is, so many people have said it's a good idea, but I don't think we've yet unpacked what we need in it and created a plan to make sure we advocate for and get it. So part of what we're looking to do with a lot of our data is actually start to kind of really emphasise this narrative about what could be in one. And I was trying to boil it down to a few simple things that we could talk about. And I think that there are kind of 5 core things that a housing strategy should have in New Zealand. 1, where do we need the houses to go? Sounds simple, but if you think about, all the different dynamics of where things are changing over time, it's actually quite a hard question to answer in detail, particularly for people to put on, places on maps, because at the moment, every local or regional council makes up their own kind of projections, and it's all tied to how much funding they can try and get for infrastructure. So everyone's incentivised in the system to want more. But that doesn't actually answer the question of where is New Zealand? Do people want to live? How do we think about managed retreat over time? There's a whole lot of exciting layers that we can unpack when we just say, where do we need houses to go? And then what tenures do we need? Do we just want market ownership, market rental, and public housing? Or do we want some other options so that we're more likely to have housing mobility at different life stages and be able to shift people, off waiting lists and into assisted and market options? And we want to kind of close that big gap in the middle so that rather than kind of a chasm where we're pushing everybody into public housing products, we've got a bit more going on. And then the third thing is, what types of houses do we need? And that's where we can get, super creative about, you might technically need a 1-bedroom if you're a single person, but what do we think people will buy? Because lots of people, if they can afford it, will get a spare room for a bit of extra space or a work from home opportunity, or because they have their grandchild come and stay with them all the time. There's all kinds of different factors that play into what types of houses we would actually choose. And I think that's a big part of the kind of dialogue about how we really need to define need if we were to do a national housing strategy. Then we need to simply answer what policy can support all these, 3 big decisions. And there are so many answers in this category. And then how do we measure success? Is kind of the big one at the end. Because at the moment, I think often we measure success in terms of number of houses delivered. And while, yes, that's a key component of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that children have been able to stay in their school zone. It doesn't necessarily mean that people haven't made trade-offs to not go to the doctors, or they've been forced into a situation where they're staying somewhere that's not safe. I should have actually mentioned there are some really compelling statistics too around the relationship between the quality of the home you live in and your mental health. And I think in a country where we do have lots of mental health challenges, some of those statistics are really stark. You're 1.6 times more likely to have mental health issues if you're living somewhere that has, significant issues around quality in terms of heating, mould, etc. So all that can be wrapped into a story of how we measure success. Okay, one of the last things I wanted to chat through was I could kind of take a deep dive into all sorts of different content, but I wanted to kind of leave you with something tangible, to think about as you left. So, show of hands, who knows about the accommodation supplement and what it is? Awesome. So for those that don't, it's a weekly income tested government payment that helps eligible New Zealanders with the cost of private housing, including rent, board or mortgage payments. So it came in as a policy in the 1970s. It used to be called the accommodation benefit. About 1 in 200 New Zealanders would receive it at the time. It cost New Zealand about $2.3 million a year, which back then, I understand, could have bought you about 95 houses, because the average house price was $24,000, just for some context. Today, or last year, 1 in 15 New Zealanders receive it, and it costs $2.4 billion a year, every year, and it's increasing. $2.4 billion will buy you about 2,893 houses, apparently, if you look at average house prices across the country. Call me crazy, but this seems like a really big increase. And it also seems like a pretty unsustainable solution. If it's been increasing this much over this time period, at what point do we say we can't afford to pay this? So what if we repurposed the accommodation supplement? Okay, here's the status quo. Of the nearly $2.4 billion a year, 68% is paid to people, like our super deserving mechanic and his partner, and 2 kids who need the money to be able to live in a market rental. The wealth, however, gets created when the landlord receives the money. So in a way, we pay $1.6 billion almost a year at the moment to private landlords. So if you were wondering what that means for you, it's approximately $337 each if you're a taxpayer. I can think of all kinds of things that could be done with $337. What if we said, okay, central government goes to the private sector, we're going to spend $2 billion a year and we'll guarantee a certain level of rental income to you for the next 30 years if you build and manage high quality homes. This turns like really unpredictable tenant rent into predictable government-backed, almost bond-like investment. So a consortia gets together of, an investment fund, a developer and a chip, and they say, that sounds like a great secure idea. They get some land, they build some fantastic stock. The friends who we met earlier are able to be supplement kind of recipients by moving into these houses at reduced rents because the consortia is receiving the subsidy. And then the consortia is able to service any loan commitment that they've had. And after 30 years, the loan is paid off, the consortia's made their money, because you still have to have a process of extracting something and making sure that those people that need to, that have taken risks, etc., can get a return on their investment. But in 30 years' time, maybe 35, I want it to be conservative, the wealth gets created because now you've got the option where the houses can actually, you can either renegotiate to continue providing reduced cost housing, but you don't have all the risk associated with delivering the stock, or our consortium wants to exit and they give the houses back into public ownership. So now we've got all these houses that we're constantly accumulating each year, and we can decide what we want to do with them. Maybe they could go into a community land trust where we don't actually need to extract that development capital. We can just make sure that we're getting enough rent that we're making sure we can pay the maintenance and it can be self-sustaining. And then all of a sudden we've switched a completely extractive process into something that actually means there might be perpetual affordability built into our housing system. There is so much detail that I would need to go into, because I'm sure there's lots of people that would have different questions and they'd want to probe different things. And, yes, there are a few barriers to overcome to make this process seem as simple as the diagram I've just drawn. But I think it's a really compelling way of rethinking our system and saying, sure, we could continue on as we are, but if we're not going to redesign it, are we just decorating problems? And how are we going to serve these different groups of people that we know our current system, and particularly our current market, are not able to serve? So, we've gone on a journey to understand the housing system. I think whatever vision you want to have for the future, no matter what lens you want to apply, and how you want to think of things. I found a great quote by someone that said that it would be fantastic if we solved housing by enabling nurses to live near hospitals and teachers to live near schools. And when I put those words into AI and said, give me a solution for Auckland, I kind of love what it came up with. So I guess I want to ask us all, visionaries see the impossible as the inevitable, they say. So what's your vision for housing in New Zealand? Whether it's for yourself, for a parent, for a child, for your neighbour, how can we make it about the people and get really creative in the way that we unpack the complexity and put it back together in a way that gives tenure security and ultimately opportunity back into the hands of New Zealanders, so that we have more entrepreneurs, more people that are able to thrive. Because I think it's truly possible, but it's going to be up to a whole lot of individuals changing the tide of the dialogue and the thinking to do so. Kia ora.